Good morning, Professor Spooner.
Good morning, Frank. It's been an amazing week.
Yes.
So it's difficult to choose what to talk about, but in fact, I think it all has to do with globalization in some way, and also with the fact that the biggest problem in globalization is organization. And I've been thinking for some time now, and I think it's probably come up on and off in previous discussions we've had, that our form of government is not working as well as it used to. Mm-hmm. And we have so much faith in what we call liberal democracy, but it's not a very old, well, I mean, the Greeks invented the idea. We thought we should be able to do it better than them, and since the 17th century we've been trying to develop it, and what we know about it now really only got to more or less something we could recognize in the 19th century, and then it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that we decided women might be eligible to participate in it. And then, of course, it was in the 1960s when everybody else got the vote in this country. And now we're talking about failed states, and the amusing thing is that I just noticed in an article in the Atlantic, which has devoted its October issue to the problem of democracy in the modern world, that James Madison in the Federalist Papers talked about the problem of passion in democracy, and that democracy couldn't be run by mobs. Mm-hmm. And it's been suggested that the reason that the current administration in America won in the 2016 elections is that the candidate was campaigning primarily to the part of the population which really knew very little about democratic values.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And one wonders whether similar things haven't been happening in other countries, because I think that even though in my opinion, the English system without a written constitution is more practical than the other countries that have written constitutions, simply because it's much easier to change the way you practice it as the society around you continues to change. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly not working quite so well in England at the moment as it has done in the past, and one wonders what's going to happen in the next couple of years before we have another election. Or another good thing about the English system is that you can call an election whenever you want to, and because right. They may call one in the current year.
Right.
But also there's the problem of Marine Le Pen and what she represents in France. And then there's the problems that Angela Merkel is having and the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. The Russians thought they would have a democratic system after the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. But obviously, well, some people might argue that in the modern world, what Putin has developed is probably the most practical system, but it's not liberal democracy.
No, far from it.
And then the Chinese, who have, in fact, an amazingly democratic system for a communist party, a system organized by the Communist Party, has made the current chair of the party and therefore the leader of the country the leader for life. It's all a very interesting. We may be in a second axial age when new political ideas are about to be tried out. Of course, the first axial age was not political ideas; it was philosophical ideas and religious ideas. Anyway,
Well, I think you could be right because it's very clear that there's a level of discontent now across most societies and most cultures and in most countries. And it's equally clear from our discussions and even from anything that you pick up and read that the governmental institutions that are charged with trying to keep pace with the discontent or satisfaction level or whatever the level is in the society or population, excuse me, that they're representing are incapable of keeping up with that kind of speed. Um, James Madison was a very far-seeing thinker, and his concern about the government being taken over by mob rule, I think, was what led to the 6-year terms of the Senate. So the Senate could act as the saucer to the teapot or to the coffee, so the coffee could be spilled out from the House of Representatives, and then it would cool in the dish. And things are going to be put to a test now in the American midterm elections next month. I think that's going to be an indication as to whether or not these institutions can even remotely hold, can they respond to the population. And if they don't, if they can't, and if what happens is the Republicans, for example, without picking party sides, win again both houses, and then the popular backlash from the Democrats over the next several months is oh, woe is us. That's going to be an indication that something's not working, because if the mechanisms such as they're set up are producing one result that the large part of the population, the majority of the population, don't want, then that means something's not right. It's not working. And when you mentioned what's going on in France and Europe, I mean, I just went through France 2 weeks ago, and there's an awful lot of discontent about Macron. And
Yeah.
but Macron is only 2 years into a 6-year term, and I mean, we'll see. That's a long term, and it's a long term on purpose. There's also a lot of questions as to whether or not Europe as a community is going to be able to survive. But there's also a realization that a number of people began to indicate to me is that what's going to happen with the Brexit is that there's not going to be a solution. There's not going to be a deal. And Theresa May is going to be faced with either the choice of a hard Brexit, which is going to cause tremendous economic disruption, or she's going to call for a new referendum, or simply choose to ignore the plebiscite of 2 years ago, which she can do. It was only because of Cameron's statement before the Brexit vote that whatever the result of the vote was, he was going to implement it one way or the other. It's not legally binding. She could walk away from it. She'd lose her position, of course, but it's thought and was suggested more than once that the die is already cast, that this is what the business interests want. They are looking to see the Brexit collapse, and she's going to be the one who's going to pay the price.
And her position also is a little bit wobbly at the moment.
Tremendously wobbly. And I think what the Europeans say by the end of November, it has to be a deal or no deal. They're not going to wait until after that.
I really don't understand that deadline, I'm afraid, because they've got till March, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
But it's amusing that the person who is probably most active with the idea that there should be a second referendum is the Mayor of London.
Right.
And but the most active Brexiteer is probably the main rival of Theresa May, Boris Johnson.
Well, it's just going to be. I guess what I'm saying is we're coming onto a critical phase now to see whether or not the institutions can hold in the American midterm elections. And whatever is worked out with the Brexit, whatever occurs in France, whatever occurs in Germany, whatever occurs in Sweden, whatever occurs in Turkey, let's see what happens. I mean, give it a.
Whether our current organizational structures can deal with it.
That's correct. That's correct.
It's really again a problem of organization, and we're not very good at it. It's much more difficult the larger the number of people, the more difficult the problem of organization is, especially if it's based on the idea that everybody has to agree.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And then of course, you're faced with the prospect now with the heightened tools of communication available, that even if you do get a result where the majority of the people are in agreement, that minority who is not in agreement has weapons now that didn't exist 100 years ago or 50 years ago. They're able to.
Yeah.
It's what's happening now. We have a minority elected president.
And we have the precedent that the Arab Spring, as it's called, was really generated by social media.
That's right. That's right. Which did not quite get the job finished. It was unable to get to Assad and was unable to get to the Saudis.
We still don't know what's going to happen there. But the most interesting thing, I think, in the whole of this, the larger context in relation to what we're talking about today, is the situation in Iran, where they have put together an amazing solution of the problem of how you relate religious authority to secular political authority, and they have a democratic political system with a religious organization that monitors whether the democratic decisions actually are allowed in religious law, which is a very clever system. The problem is that it's threatened by their insistence on that women have to wear uniforms in public, which is probably going to cause the end of it in not too distant future. Even though what's happening in Iranian cities, as far as everyday social life is concerned, is pretty much the same as what's happening here.
Well, they could deal with that if they dealt with that and took that piece off the argument table. It would be very interesting indeed to see how that works out.
I don't think they can. I don't think they're capable of dealing with that. I think that's one thing that the religious scholars would be incapable of giving up. Well, and it's also, on the other side, something that the women are incapable of giving up, because I remember when I lived in Iran in the 60s, they were more sexily dressed than they were here.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of rigidity is not going to get you anywhere, as we know. So, well, that's very interesting.
So,
what do you think will happen this week?
Well, there's bound to be some sort of development on about the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's probably going to be the main development in the coming week. And it's very difficult to see which way it's going to go, because there's so much passion on both sides. But I think the passion on the what should I say, the Democratic side is probably increasing, and whether the passion on the Republican side will continue to hold, I'm not sure.
Well, we will know next week, and maybe we can figure out a way to use that as a bellwether or indication of trends in globalization. All right, Professor Spooner, thank you very much. I'll talk to you next week. Thank you.
See you next week.